Hi, everyone.
Hello. 276 in Ray Franz's In Search of Christian Freedom, talking about Watchtower absolutism. That the fact that they make many issues life or death by the very fact that they are willing to disfellowship people for these offenses. He says, in its absolutist approach and categorizing practice, a paradox is found in that Watchtower's organizational policy allows membership in labor unions. Yet the organization knows that labor unions are clearly a strong political force. It condemns participation in strikes as being a form of coercion by intimidation. It rules that anyone holding an official position in a union is not exemplary, hence could not be an elder or ministerial servant. It declares picketing to be unchristian. Yet, strangely, says that if on refusing picketing work, the witness is directed to do substitute work or alternative service, of cleaning the union hall or answering telephones, etc., this is up to his conscience rather. So doing substitute work instead of picketing is up to the personal conscience. Why is such service in substitution for picketing not viewed in the same way that work in substitution for military services? And why, with all these claimed unchristian aspects, does membership in the union not make the witness laborer unclean, tainted? How does the Watchtower Society get around the evident contradiction in policy? It does this by simply telling witnesses that they can look on union membership as a form of job insurance. Yet they could not look on membership in the YMCA, in the use of its exercising and swimming facilities, as health insurance, or in the case of Malawian witnesses, the holding of a party card as home insurance or even life insurance.
Once again, it is a case of religious leaders dictating to the individual as to when he or she may hold mental reservations and when not. The governing body is willing, for legal benefits, to classify the witness organization as hierarchical, though outside of the court it would deny that as being the case. This is certainly a seeking of accommodation by a measure of compromise. Compromise is not something necessarily or inherently wrong. It implies a degree of yielding, and life demands certain compromise on the part of all of us in order to live and work with others. The wrong comes when we begin to compromise our principles. The organization accords to itself the right to present itself to the world in a form it elsewhere strongly condemns, and not view this as a compromise of principle, but denies to its members the corresponding right to decide what they can do in good conscience when faced with circumstances equally or even more difficult for them. The view the religious leaders chooses to take regarding a matter is imposed on all below as the view they must take. The fact that the governing body members in their cloistered, protected ivory tower circumstances rarely have to face the difficulties, hardships, or problems that the ordinary witnesses must face seems to have no cautionary or restraining effect on their readiness to impose their views on the individual members.
Ray did allude to Matthew 15 in here, which we read before, about the traditions of men superseding the commandments of God when it comes to the way things play out. Not that the religious leaders of his day were saying no to Moses, they were saying yes to Moses, but they were adding to Moses a lot of their own traditions, such as the Korban in that specific example in Matthew 15, where people would give religious gifts and ignore their responsibility to their parents.
Yeah, so there you're breaking a principle and a direct command to honor your parents.
And I think comes to mind too, Romans 14, which we have also alluded to before, but is well worth reconsidering in this context. about rules.
Welcome the man having weaknesses in his faith, but not to make decisions on inward questionings. One man has faith to eat everything, but the man who is weak eats vegetables. Let the one eating not look down on the one not eating, and let the one not eating not judge the one eating, for God has welcomed that one. Who are you to judge the house servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls. Yes, that's a very good principle. You have to be considering other people's conscience, not telling them what their conscience is or what they should have in their conscience.
So did Paul or any of the apostles view this as somehow signaling disunity if brothers within the same faith exercise their consciences in different ways? Would that be a sign of disunity? So in the Watchtower's way of looking at the world in Scripture, yes. But Christians would recognize what the Watchtower thinks of as unity is uniformity.
A liberty of conscience, that you allow the other person on things that are not direct commands or stands of the Scripture. If it's something that isn't clear cut, not black and white, then you should allow the person to make a decision as to how their conscience would work with that.
The traditional Christian view, which the Watchtower somehow views as disunity of Christendom, is in essentials unity. That's why they have in Christendom creeds that they all agree on.
Right.
But in essentials, no, conscience. Liberty.
Yeah. Right. So, and this is what we have found in our years of 30 years now of association with different churches, that there is allowing of people to have different periods of growth in their spiritual strength. So what one person's conscience won't allow them to do, maybe later in their growth, they'll change their view on it. But that opportunity of growth is allowed the person. It's not a fixed rule by the church. So
And
they're not legalistic. They don't impose on others.
This principle of maturity versus immaturity is obviously always there. But just like in the first century, the principle was, well, the conscience of a Jewish believer would be perhaps drastically different than the conscience of a Gentile believer, and even they would differ among themselves.
Yeah.
And then what are you going to do with that? You're going to enforce by rules a certain standard on everyone in the name of a bogus unity?
So a good example would be the Corinthian church, where it discusses this. There were people who were very upset about something, and others that didn't seem to think it mattered that much. There was two stands, and then Paul's recommendation for them to be conscientious about the other guy's conscience, not your own, but the other guy's. If it bothers him, don't do it in his presence. Like, be kind to one another, seemed to be the thought behind it.
It can't be an accident that that's the great love epistle, right? Chapter 13 of Corinthians. But that part you just discussed, 1 Corinthians 6 to 8, is where he's discussing how this plays out in a real world situation where you're invited for a meal, and if you're a Jew you might respond one way, and if you're a Gentile another way, and especially if there's some kind of thing like meat or drink involved that somehow, in your mind at least, smacks of idolatrous rituals.
Yeah, you don't have to make a show of things either. Like with witnesses, you make a show of it. You know, I can remember as a little kid going to school events, and if there was hot dogs there, I had to ask, what kind of hot dog is it? And if it wasn't, kosher, then I had to refuse it. Whereas the principle in Corinthians is, if your conscience would be bothered, certainly don't eat something. But otherwise, he says, if you give thanks to God for things, you've given thanks to God for them. That's another take on it. So if your conscience would allow for that, then that's how you would go.
Yeah, again, the apostle doesn't make rules. And if anyone ever had the right to make rules, it was the Apostle Paul, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who was the apostle to the Gentiles. No governing body, the apostle to the Gentiles.
And given his background, he would have been more rules inclined in the past.
He would have been as a Pharisee.
Mhm.
In the next segment, setting double standards. See you next time.